I've always thought that 8 years of marriage to Carrie meant we knew each other inside out. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but we had something solid. Or at least, I thought we did. Lately, though, things felt off. It started small, like a faint itch you can't quite scratch. She laughed a little too much at her phone, brushing it off when I asked what was so funny. Then she started dressing up for the smallest errands. I chalked it up to a phase, but deep down, something didn't sit right with me. The tipping point came 2 weeks ago when her car broke down. Normally, Carrie would have it towed to the dealership, but this time, she insisted on bringing it to my repair shop. "It's easier," she said with a shrug, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I offered to have it prioritized. It's my shop, after all, but she waved me off. "No rush. Tomorrow's fine," she said, her tone too casual. Her words lingered with me longer than they should have. Something about the way she smiled before she walked out the door. It wasn't her usual smile. It was guarded, almost calculated. The next day, she showed up at the shop earlier than expected to pick up the car. I was in my office finishing some paperwork, but through the window, I caught sight of her chatting with Greg, one of my mechanics. Greg's always been the overly confident type, with a grin that borders on obnoxious. But this time, he wasn't just flashing it at anyone. He was directing it at Carrie. And what really got to me? She wasn't brushing him off. She was smiling back, leaning in like she didn't mind his proximity. I told myself to stop overthinking. Maybe Greg was just being his usual cocky self, and Carrie was too polite to cut him off. Still, I couldn't ignore the tight knot forming in my stomach. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, and I hated that I couldn't brush it off. That evening, I found myself replaying the scene in my head. The way Greg laughed too hard at whatever she said. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture she usually saved for when she was nervous or worse, flirting. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was just picking up her car. There was nothing to it. But the unease didn't leave me. Then, as I was reviewing payroll logs that night, I noticed something strange. Greg had clocked out late, almost an hour after closing time, on the same day Carrie picked up her car. The reason listed? After hours work. But there wasn't a single job that day I could recall needing overtime. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Was it a coincidence? Or was my gut finally connecting the dots? The questions swirled in my mind, refusing to settle. I thought about the shop's security cameras. It felt wrong to even consider checking them, like I was violating some unspoken rule of trust. But trust only works when it's mutual, and for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't sure if it was. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Carrie's smile at the shop, the way Greg leaned in too close, and that damn time log showing him clocking out late. My mind spun with possibilities, each worse than the last. By morning, the knot in my stomach had turned into a full-blown storm. After work, I stayed behind at the shop, waiting until everyone had left. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. I sat in my office, staring at the security camera system. My finger hovered over the playback button, hesitating. This felt wrong, like I was betraying Carrie somehow. But the weight of my suspicions was unbearable. I needed to know. I pulled up the footage from the day Carrie came to pick up her car. At first, everything seemed normal. She walked in, smiling, and chatted with Greg on the shop floor while I worked in my office. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching as her car was pulled out of the bay, ready to go. That's when things started to feel off. Instead of leaving, Carrie lingered near the shop floor, her posture casual but deliberate. Greg finished wiping down tools and gestured toward the break room. Carrie followed him without hesitation. My heart sank as I watched the door close behind them. They stayed in there for 20 minutes. I didn't need to watch anymore. My imagination was cruel enough, filling in the gaps with vivid, painful images. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep watching. When they finally came out, Greg was smirking like he'd just won the lottery. Carrie, on the other hand, looked composed, but there was a faint blush on her cheeks, a detail that stung more than I cared to admit. I sat back in my chair, the air thick and suffocating. My shop, my livelihood, had become the stage for their betrayal. The thought of Greg's smug grin and Carrie's betrayal boiled my blood, but beneath the anger was a crushing sense of loss. How could she do this? And with someone like him? That night, I drove home in silence, the footage burned into my memory. I walked into the house, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me. Carrie was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of pasta, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. She turned to smile at me, her face so familiar, so seemingly innocent, and for a moment, I almost doubted what I'd seen. But then her phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it instinctively. The screen lit up with a message from a name that twisted my stomach. Greg. I didn't read the full text. Just his name was enough to reignite the anger simmering beneath the surface. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I was certain of what to say, how to say it, and what to do next. That night, I lay awake beside her, the space between us feeling like a canyon. Every time she shifted, I wondered if she was dreaming of him. The thought made my chest tighten. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Why him? Was it something I did? Or didn't do? The next morning, while Carrie was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The passcode hadn't changed. She'd always trusted me not to snoop. But this wasn't about trust anymore. It was about finding the truth. I picked up the phone, my hands steady but my heart pounding. I opened her messages and found Greg's name at the top. My chest tightened as I tapped on the thread. The messages were worse than I'd imagined. Flirty banter turned into intimate confessions, and the timestamps matched the day she picked up her car. There was no room for doubt anymore. The evidence was all there, staring back at me, each word a dagger to my chest. I closed the messages and set the phone down, my hands trembling now. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was careless, reckless, and unapologetically disrespectful. I felt a mix of rage and heartbreak, but above all, a sense of resolve. That night, when Carrie came home, I knew it was time. I was already sitting in the living room when Carrie walked through the door that evening. She dropped her bag by the entrance, humming softly, oblivious to the tension thickening the air. Her smile faltered when she saw me sitting there, hands clasped in front of me, her phone resting on the coffee table between us. "Hey," she said, hesitating. "What's going on?" For a moment, I didn't answer. I just stared at her, taking in the person I thought I knew. The person who'd laughed with me over silly inside jokes, who'd promised me forever on our wedding day. And now, standing in front of me, was someone I barely recognized. "Were you going to tell me about Greg?" I asked, my voice cold, steady. Her expression shifted instantly. Her smile vanished, replaced by a mixture of confusion and dread. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice trembled. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, leaning forward. I gestured toward her phone on the table. "I know, Carrie. I've seen the messages. The security footage. Everything." Her face went pale, and for a brief moment, she was frozen. Then the tears came, fast and messy. "I can explain," she stammered, reaching out toward me, but I pulled back before she could touch me. "Explain," I said, the bitterness in my tone cutting through her sobs. "Go ahead. Explain how you thought sneaking around with one of my employees, in my shop, was a good idea." She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice muffled. "It was just... I don't even know how it happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words lit a fire inside me. "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" I snapped, standing up. "So what was it, Carrie? Just a fling? Something to pass the time?" Because it wasn't just one mistake. This took effort. Messages, meeting up, lying to my face. She looked up at me, tears streaking her cheeks. I was feeling neglected, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You've been so busy with the shop, and I needed someone to notice me. Her excuse hit me like a punch to the gut. Neglected? After everything I'd done to build a life for us, to make sure she had everything she needed? The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. So it's my fault? I said finally, my voice low and dangerous. You're blaming me for this? No, she cried, shaking her head. That's not what I meant. I was lonely, okay? And Greg, he was there. He listened to me. He made me feel wanted. The raw honesty in her words was almost worse than the betrayal itself. I stared at her, struggling to process the magnitude of what she was saying. Wanted. I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Do you have any idea what you've done? To me. To us. She broke down completely then, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clutching at the edges of the coffee table like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. Please, just give me a chance. Her words hung in the air, desperate and hollow. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a terrible mistake, that we could somehow piece our lives back together. But the images of her and Greg in the break room, the messages, the lies, they were burned into my mind. There was no going back from this. I don't think I can, I said quietly, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to hold it together. I don't think I can ever trust you again. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of anguish. Please, she whispered. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. I turned away, unable to look at her. You already gave up on us, Carrie, I said. When you chose him, you made that decision for both of us. Her sobs filled the silence that followed, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. The weight of her betrayal was too much, pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to breathe under the enormity of it all. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spoke again. I need time to think, I said, my voice hollow. I can't do this right now. She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. Okay, she whispered. Take all the time you need. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But as she walked away, retreating to the bedroom with her shoulders slumped and her sobs echoing down the hall, I knew in my heart that there was no fixing this. Some things, once broken, can never be put back together. The next morning, I drove to the shop early, long before any of the employees were scheduled to arrive. The silence of the empty building was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my head. Every tool, every workstation, every detail of the place reminded me of the betrayal that had unfolded here. My sanctuary, my pride and joy, was now tainted. By the time Greg walked in, his cocky swagger as insufferable as ever, I was already waiting in my office. Hey, boss, he said with that trademark smirk, oblivious to the storm about to crash down on him. What's up? Close the door, I said, my tone sharp enough to cut through his casual demeanor. His smirk faltered slightly, but he complied, closing the door behind him and standing awkwardly near the desk. Greg, I began, leaning forward, my elbows resting on the desk. I know about you and Carrie. His face paled instantly. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then he tried to recover, the smirk creeping back onto his face, though it looked more forced now. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, chuckling nervously. Don't insult my intelligence, I snapped, standing up abruptly. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound echoing in the small office. I've seen the security footage. I've seen the messages. I know everything. Greg's smirk vanished completely. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His usual bravado was nowhere to be found, replaced by a mixture of panic and guilt. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I continued, my voice rising. "You didn't just betray me, you disrespected me. In my own shop. Do you understand how low that is?" He stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Look, man, I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of hand. I'm sorry. I really am. Sorry." I repeated, my voice cold and sharp. "You're sorry now, after you've been caught. Do you think that makes it better? Do you think that fixes anything?" He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "It wasn't just me," he muttered weakly, as if that somehow absolved him. "I don't care who started it," I shot back. "The fact is, you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew she was my wife, and you did it anyway. That's on you, Greg. And I won't tolerate it." His head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Wait," he said, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "You're not firing me, are you? You think you can keep working here after this?" I said, incredulous. "You think I'm going to let you stay after what you've done? Get real, Greg. Pack your things. You're done." "Come on, man," he pleaded, taking a step closer. "I need this job. I've got bills to pay. You can't just throw me out like this." "Watch me," I said, my voice ice cold. "You should have thought about that before you decided to mess around with my wife. Actions have consequences, Greg, and now you're facing yours." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. But he must have seen something in my face, something that told him I wasn't bluffing. Without another word, he turned and left the office. I followed him out, watching as he grabbed his things and stormed out of the building. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the shop. The other employees, who had started arriving, looked on in stunned silence. I didn't offer them an explanation. I didn't owe them one. All I said was, "Let's get to work," before retreating back to my office. That evening, I walked into the house and found Carrie sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and dread. "Did you?" she began hesitantly. "Did you fire him?" "Yes," I said curtly, not bothering to sit down. "He's gone. And I don't want to hear his name again." She nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up for us, for trying to make this work." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Don't thank me, Carrie. I didn't fire him for us. I fired him because I refused to let someone like that stay in my life. And that goes for you too, if I can't trust you to change." Her tears spilled over, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders trembling. "I'll do anything," she whispered. "Anything to fix this." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving her sobs echoing in the living room. The following days were a blur of awkward silences and tense interactions. Carrie tiptoed around me like she was walking on broken glass, her every word measured, every action careful. She apologized endlessly, repeating promises to make things right, but none of it stuck. Her words felt empty, like they were designed to patch a wound too deep to heal. I wasn't much better. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, bubbling up when I least expected it. The smallest things, her tone, her movements, even the sight of her phone, would set me off. I hated how much space she still occupied in my mind, how every glance at her reminded me of Greg and the betrayal that had unfolded in my own shop. On the third night after firing Greg, Carrie approached me as I was sitting at the kitchen table. She was holding her phone, and her expression was resolute. "I've blocked him," she said, showing me the screen. "Deleted his number. Deleted everything. He's gone." I glanced at the screen, noting the absence of his name in her contacts. "Good," I said flatly, looking back at the pile of papers in front of me. "But that doesn't change what happened." She set the phone down, her hand trembling slightly. I know it doesn't, she said, her voice breaking. But I'm trying, okay? I'm trying to show you that I want to fix this. I looked up at her, my eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like days. She looked fragile, desperate, but I didn't feel the pity she seemed to be hoping for. Instead, I felt the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Do you even understand what you did, Carrie? I asked, my voice low but sharp. Do you know how humiliating it is? To find out that my wife cheated on me with one of my employees? In my own shop. You didn't just betray me. You disrespected me in ways I didn't think were possible. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't interrupt. She stood there, absorbing every word like it was a punishment she thought she deserved. I've spent the last 8 years building this life for us, I continued. And in one careless, selfish decision, you threw it all away. How am I supposed to move past that? She sank into the chair across from me, her head in her hands. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know how to fix this. But I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make you trust me again. Love. I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. You don't betray the people you love, Carrie. Love doesn't look like this. The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't have a response, and I didn't expect one. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, I said, turning to leave. I need space. The next few days were no better. Carrie tried to cling to what little hope remained, suggesting couples counseling, apologizing over and over, and doing everything she could to show she was willing to change. But every time I looked at her, all I saw was the betrayal. The messages. The footage. The fact that she'd chosen someone else over me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt suffocating. I needed clarity, and I wasn't going to find it here. That weekend, I told Carrie I was leaving for a while. I need time to think, I said as I packed a bag. This isn't working. I need to figure out what I want. She didn't argue. She just stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. Take all the time you need, she said quietly. I'll be here, waiting. I drove to a friend's cabin a few hours away, a secluded spot surrounded by trees and silence. It was exactly what I needed, a place to clear my head, free from the constant reminders of what had happened. I spent the first few days sitting by the lake, staring out at the water and letting my thoughts settle. Slowly, the truth became clearer. I couldn't stay with Carrie. The trust between us was shattered, and no amount of therapy or apologies would bring it back. Every memory of our life together felt tainted, every promise we'd made hollow. When I returned home, Carrie was waiting for me in the living room. The moment I walked in, she stood, her eyes searching mine for some sign of hope. I've made my decision, I said, my voice steady. I want a divorce. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, start fresh, anything. Just don't give up on us. It's too late, Carrie, I said, shaking my head. You gave up on us the moment you chose him. I can't forgive that. I can't live with it. She sobbed, falling to her knees, but I didn't move to comfort her. I'd spent too much time carrying the weight of her choices, and I couldn't do it anymore. The divorce papers were filed the next day. It's been months now, and while the pain of what happened still lingers, I'm starting to feel like myself again. The house is quieter, emptier, but it's also a place of peace now, a space where I can heal. Carrie's betrayal taught me a painful lesson about trust and respect, but it also taught me something about myself. I deserve better. I deserve someone who values me, who respects me, and who doesn't treat my love like it's disposable. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. I'll never settle for less than I deserve again.